In this episode of the Omega Podcast, we have the founder and president of Advanced Air Mobility Institute discussing autonomous flight, legislation, drones, and much more. Digitized for excellence.
Welcome to the Omega Podcast with Dan Sloat. He is a JD MBA with prior experience as a U.S. Air Force captain with operational experience as a UAS traffic management expert. Dan is the founder and president of the international nonprofit research center, the Advanced Air Mobility Institute. He serves on the World Economic Forum Aviate Committee to advise on autonomous flight. Dan, it is so great to have you on the Omega Podcast.
Keenan, great to see you.
Absolutely. It is so great to see you as well and to dive deep into your realm of autonomous flight and airplanes and drones. It's so exciting. And I know for many of our listeners, they're going to be extremely excited to learn more about this area. But for those that may or may not know, can you share a bit more about yourself and maybe a bit more about your initial days starting in your career?
Yes, certainly. So, this advanced air mobility space, Keenan, it's far and beyond both a personal and professional passion of mine. I was a professional aviator, right? Captain of the United States Air Force. I mean, I would spend sometimes as many as 18 hours on an aircraft, right? And in my free time, I absolutely love traveling. Massachusetts is now the 10th state that I've lived in, been to something like 60 countries. So been on a lot of airplanes is what I'm getting at. And it's something that was just very, very striking to me. I came across a statistic, that over 80% of the world's population has never stepped foot on an aircraft even once. And that really struck me because after my time in service, I decided to go back to school. And I'd always had an affinity for business. And so I took a concentration of courses at the intersection of international business and human rights. And it was the kind of thing where, armed with that statistic, it was very striking to me when I learned that, this notion of human rights, chief among them, for example, security of person, right? That, no matter who you are, wherever your citizenship may lay, that it is a human right to be able to freely decide, where you are, right? To be free from false imprisonment, right? That's very central. Right. Many human rights have dire consequences, but there was a particular human right that was enshrined, I believe it's Article 26 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that we have a right to share in the benefits our collective scientific achievements. And as far as I'm concerned, powered flight aviation is one of humanity's greatest achievements. And to know that over 80% of the population has never once experienced it, it's unfortunate, and we're certainly missing the mark. What I love so much about advanced air mobility is that we have a real opportunity here, not only to expand the kind of the breadth, but also the frequency, the benefits of aviation. And to be very clear, these new aircraft, eVTOLs, which stands for electric vertical takeoff and landing, those are intended both for cargo and passenger carrying, which I haven't got a chance to fly in one myself, maybe actually as soon as this spring. They're already flying in China, this particular model, the EHang EH216. And by the way, they're being flown remotely. So there's no licensed pilot on board, which is a monumental shift. That's going to take a lot of people, a bit of time, right? No one wants to be a guinea pig and put themselves in, further risk in that way. But they're essentially like supersized drones. Some people are quick to, isn't it just more like an electric helicopter? Some models do either they have primarily the certified conventional helicopter body, and it's just electric propulsion. But the vast majority of these are multi-copter, right? It really is the avionics, the propulsion systems are just scaled up versions, some of the most popular and stable drone platforms. And a very popular use case that's promoted in the industry is this idea of an air taxi, right? I mean, today, the notion that someone would take off on an aircraft of any kind in one city and land in that same city seems ridiculous. Of course, we've had conventional helicopters for decades and decades, but it's for the for your average person, it's limited to if you've ever been on a conventional helicopter. It's like maybe you're really splurging on, some kind of like sightseeing tour, heaven forbid you're on a helicopter because you're getting air medevac, right? Or search and rescue missions. I mean, rescue at sea. Like there's a lot of, generally speaking, if you're in a helicopter, it's either you're in a really bad situation or you are kind of maybe on vacation. And so it's not, it's kind of an absurd notion to land in the same city that you took off, right? When it comes to aviation, especially because we have so many different other means, right? There's taxi, there's rideshare, buses and metros and trains and so forth. But with air taxis, it's possible that people use these as part of their daily commute, which is kind of a wild notion. At the Advanced Air Mobility Institute, we actually ran a kind of a community feasibility study for the city of Seattle. And we found that, for example, individuals who lived, let's say, on the other side of Puget Sound from downtown Seattle on one of the various islands, like Bainbridge Island, who make use of a ferry as part of their daily commute, ferry to downtown, and then maybe a car or another means of ground transportation. That if your commute was to perhaps Redmond, global headquarters of Microsoft, through use of an eVTOL, you could be saving as much as 400 hours a year in commute, which is just kind of, mind-boggling. Right? I'm certain you'd agree, Keenan, if you had an extra 400 hours in a year and useful hours, right? These are, 7 to 8 a.m. and 5 to 6 p.m., right? These are where it's not that you're doing anything of value. You're just getting from work or to work. And so quality of life can go up dramatically. I'm particularly excited about accelerating access for this technology on the front end, especially for UAS drone technology. Get that in more hands of first responders, right? I mean, the increase to effectiveness for the public safety mission is phenomenal, right? We can be delivering emergency medicine or tourniquets. I saw a project recently where they're trying to take defibrillators airborne, right? That someone needs their heart jump started, right? I've seen others where drones supplement lifeguards on a beach, right? Where they actually make use of computer vision, and they've got the algorithms that, amazingly, I think this would be actually kind of hard for the human eye to distinguish between, like, what does the kind of like splashing in the water, if you will, what's the difference between like this person is drowning versus this person's just having fun playing around. But apparently there are companies, that are, figuring this out and then having the proper kind of triggering effects to send a drone out and deliver, life preserver, the kind of thing where a lifeguard in many cases couldn't possibly, maybe through the use of like a jet ski, but sometimes they just can't get far enough out to reach the person in time. And so, and there's also donated organ transport, wildfire suppression, search and rescue missions with use of, thermal imaging. It's pretty incredible. And I would say that really the catalyst behind launching the Advanced Air Mobility Institute was kind of a twofold mission. Formally, it's to educate and advocate for the broadest public benefit through the AM ecosystem globally. But at its core, it's about that specific human right that I addressed early on about, we're all in this together, right? I mean, the baker is making food for the scientists to eat. The car mechanic is helping them get to and from the lab. You've got the professors who helped those aerospace engineers, master, very critical thermodynamics, right? And I think it's only fair. Right. I mean, each of us we're trying to specialize and add real value in all these different facets of life. There should be a concerted effort that people get to enjoy to share in those benefits, right? What are we able to achieve as a society? And then there's the other end of the spectrum, which is certainly a bit more somber. This technology is a tool like any other, right? A handsaw in the hands of a talented, skilled carpenter can make some excellent furniture. But of course, as we know, in the wrong hands, it can do a lot of harm. And this technology is no different. And I think it's plainly too naive to just assume that it will work in everyone's best interest. Understandably, a lot of people have had legitimate concerns surrounding privacy, right, as it comes to drones. So that needs to be closely regulated. Make sure that rights are not trampled upon as this is kind of, we tend towards, mass adoption. So that's kind of in a nutshell why we launched the AM Institute. I'm beyond proud of this team, all volunteer through, we did a soft launch in March of last year, officially filed with the IRS in April. So we're still not even a year old. And believe it or not, we're already by both member headcount and by LinkedIn followership, if that can be, I know that's far from a perfect, metric. But by both of those measures, the largest advanced air mobility nonprofit in the world. We have representatives now in 44 countries.
Your comments and feedback shape the future of the Omega podcast. Leave us a comment and share with your colleagues. Now let's get back to this future-forward conversation.
That's incredible. And I know that throughout that response, there was a lot of incredible insight that you provided regarding, Advanced Air Mobility Institute. And I was one of the ecosystem consultants when you guys first launched. So that was an extremely amazing privilege. But I think for those that are thinking about the future and planning for the future, especially when it comes to regulations and laws that are going to be put in place to make sure that these drones that we are going to be flying in human beings versus, a robot, what type of laws do you think need to come into play? You mentioned privacy concerns as being one of the critical points, but what other areas should legislators, those that are part of the Supreme Court that's going to be mandating these drones that are going to be flying all around the states, what should they be considering if they're listening to our podcast?
Yes. Well, first let me say, absolutely. We couldn't have accomplished anywhere as much as we did without, talented advisors and consultants like yourself. We spent an incredible amount of time trying to very carefully curate an organization with expertise as diverse and broad as we could possibly find, and all of which have a fairly unique expertise, some of which are very, very close to the technology, in fact, building these eVTOL aircraft, while others, for example, my friend and colleague, Dr. Sadie, right? He's on faculty at Harvard Medical. I'm not incredibly smart guy. If we need to know, what's the practical, operational range of a specific drone model, he's not the guy to ask. But he has incredible insights into, for example, like I touched upon earlier, what are the meaningful windows for a donated organ, right? How much time do we have to actually get it to the organ failure clinic? And so I think the point that I'm trying to make is, there's that classic expression, right, of it takes a village to raise a child. Okay, well, if it takes a village to raise a child, like, what does it take to launch an entirely new form of transportation, right? We need talented, passionate people from every walk of life, from every discipline. And what we're striving for at the AM Institute is to be a platform by which to share those insights and engage in discourse and debate about how do we achieve these shared goals. I suppose advice that I would give to local, state, even federal decision makers is that a lot of the industry is quick to point to the need for public acceptance, right? Which, of course, no question about it. Society needs to whether it's a formal vote or otherwise, they need to be in favor of it. But of course, it's how can you possibly be expected to accept something if you don't have awareness or opportunities to ask questions from an unbiased, impartial body, right? And that's really where we're trying to position ourselves to be a resource, not only for the everyday citizens because we got to give people more credit, right? They're not dumb. If there's a new industry, if you ask a for-profit company, whether this is a good thing or bad thing, of course they're gonna be tempted, at least, right, to overstate the benefits and downplay the risks. And even to some extent, right, government entities, they have their own temptations, right? If they want to be perceived as a champion of a certain technology, they may similarly overstate benefits and downplay any risks. So we're striving to provide a bit of that impartiality, precisely because we don't have the profit motive. While we're positioning to be a resource for everyday people, of course, we want to be a resource to those decision makers. As a 501c3, of course, there's certain elections that we could take to in the IRS tax code that we could engage in a bit of lobbying, but that's not a direction that we want to go. But certainly, if we're invited to answer questions, to help educate decision makers, that is perfectly in line with our mission. And I think so much of it, in terms of public awareness, we just have to get the word out. We have to, I'm sure you've seen plenty of this just in your personal life, right? If you've got like kind of give an example, like maybe something kind of wacky, like maybe you and a friend were planning a trip to, I don't know, Florida, right? Kind of a callback to, to when we first met. And maybe that was the plan for a couple months, right? Whatever plans change. And now you're thinking, hey, California makes more sense, right? We all kind of understand that change is hard for people, right? And it's, to the extent there's a bit of that, bad news doesn't get better with time. I wouldn't particularly say that a trip to California is bad news compared to a trip to Florida. But point being, we all understand that people need time to just kind of adjust, right? So we need to act on that wisdom, that collective wisdom of just exposing slowly and gently communities to this kind of technology. Let them ask their questions. Let them be assured that, for example, concerns about noise are being addressed. Right? There's a brilliant former NASA scientist who now leads a company down in Tennessee called Whisper Aero. The technology that they're building in terms of jet propulsion is mind-boggling. I mean, this is brilliant marketing, right? Whisper Aero. I mean, it's precisely in the name. What are they good at? They're good at building ultra quiet jet propulsion. And in fact, they've been very clever and adapted that technology for use in leaf blowers. Right? I mean, we've all been there trying to sleep in on a Saturday, right? And some eager neighbor, is out there at the crack of dawn. And there's also a fair amount of, the human element, right? Peace and quiet is something that the vast majority of people, at least at some point in their life or even in a given day, that they really do value peace and quiet. And so one of the big draws of advanced air mobility in particular is that many of these propulsion systems are not only just in relative terms, but categorically more quiet than conventional helicopters. And so there's a whole lot of potential. I mean, it's an incredibly exciting space.
It definitely is. And I know it's important for those that are planning for the future to get an idea as to what type of these vehicles we should be looking forward to. Do you know of perhaps one or two examples that you can provide our listeners to that they can be able to keep watch of if it goes to market or if they are mandated as feasible vehicles to start flying?
So there are two eVTOL manufacturers that are quite ahead of the pack. They've just plainly been developing their solutions for. They had quite a head start, and they're actually both out of California. Joby Aviation, as well as Archer, and they've got Joby signed an agreement with Delta Airlines. Archer signed an agreement with United Airlines. Kind of ironically, a British manufacturer, eVTOLs, signed with American Airlines. So another manufacturer out of Vermont signed with UPS. They're known as Beta. They are leading with a cargo use case. I mean, and there's, gosh, Keenan, at one point there were as many as 800 different models actively being developed for these aircraft. And part of what makes it so wildly ambitious is that many of these systems were clean sheet, as in every single component was designed and built from the ground up. In just from a practicality standpoint, that's credible, engineering challenge. What makes that even more ambitious is that in the world of aviation, every single component needs to be independently certified, right? And then as their component systems, and then how they, support and interact with all of the other elements of this total aviation system. I mean, it was a monumental undertaking. And I'll say that, I mentioned that these are already flying over in China. Are my good friends and colleagues over at Urban V, which is a vertiport provider. Vertiport, by the way, is the name for the intelligent infrastructure that will be legally mandated for these aircraft. To the average person, they will probably look like a heliport, but because the long-term plan is that these vehicles fly completely autonomously, right? Self-flying aircraft. Of course, they need a much greater extent of embedded technologies and sensors so that not only the vehicles can communicate with each other, but then upon takeoff and on landing, the two most critical, right, in terms of safety, that those landings are very, very closely coordinated. They actually recently received a approval in the nation of Italy to begin flights in December, right? So in preparation for the Jubilee year 2025, these things are coming. Right. I mean, there's been plans for a kind of at least a ceremonial, debut flight of a German manufacturer called Volocopter in concert with the Paris Olympics here in July. And I feel confident that there will be, some kind of offering available, even if it was, for example, to transport the Olympic athletes themselves for the Los Angeles Summer Olympics 2028. There's a lot, and there's a bit of jockeying, right? I mean, this is made for a global race, and it's exciting to see. And I think for me, my hope is that in this fervor, right, to be first in all of these exciting new milestones, again, that we don't lose sight of human dignity. When you're talking about transportation, we need to be crystal clear that when the payload is cargo, right, inanimate objects, that be treated in very clear and distinct ways, greater level of safety, attention, and care. Payload are people themselves, right? That the flying public, that passengers always be treated with a greater level of professionalism and safety redundancy. I think in particular, you'd probably have quite a bit of interest in the cybersecurity challenges in this space. I read a statistic, something like 85% of all drones operated, even by like official, law enforcement, for example, the vast majority are controlled on completely unencrypted signals, right? That's that's a vulnerability, and certainly if you were to kind of look up and you see a drone, especially if it had the markings that, appeared to be, police, acting under in law, what we call the color of law, but then it was to engage in some kind of dangerous or threatening kind of posture or activity. I mean, that's the kind of thing where people quickly, you start to lose trust, in some of our most important institutions, right? So traditionally with an aircraft, right, if someone were to take by force, go over an aircraft, right, we kind of universally have this consensus that that's wrong and that we need to punish hijackers, to the fullest extent. But in this new era with remotely piloted aircraft, especially with passengers on board, it's kind of this whole additional layer of, and to an extent, because there's been stories of passengers, right, seeing a hostile takeover of an aircraft, a hijacking, in motion, or even cases where there was an attempt, and the passengers themselves like took bold action. I mean, it's a kind of like your heart's got to be going, 1,000 beats a minute to have enough adrenaline to take down an armed, would-be or effective hijacker. If you don't know that your aircraft the control has been seized, right, by someone who's not authorized, you don't even know to be on guard or right, maybe look for an opportunity. Maybe the aircraft is still kind of low enough, perhaps, that you could risk jumping out, right? Maybe, maybe sprain an ankle or right, but these are things that we have to contend with. And so the cybersecurity element is particularly important to us at the AIM Institute. In fact, our 3 guiding principles: safety, dignity, and security. I genuinely believe we can do a lot of good in the world with this kind of technology, but we also have to make sure that we spend enough time and resources, right, to think through and be proactive, think about how this, also take time to think about how it might be abused. And importantly, what steps can we put into place to try to mitigate that? Because of course, ideally, we thwart any kind of wrongdoing before it even has a chance to start.
For sure. And thank you so much for that response. And I just want to make sure we're very courteous of your time, Dan. Are there any final remarks or final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have our board of liaisons. I mentioned we now have 44 countries represented. We are looking for representatives. Now they need to have a strong working knowledge of this space, right? Either UAS drones or eVTOLs, and their primary residence be in the country that they represent. But we want to grow until we've painted the town red, if you will. And so we could have as many as 200 liaisons by the end. So by all means, take time to visit our website, aminstitute.org. On our liaison page, we've got a map of the countries represented and those that are yet to be. Also kind of rolling applications for the senior advisor roles. We have a research council where we support graduate and PhD candidates who are studying this space in particular, connecting them with industry experts, doing what we can, right? We all went to school to try to, improve our marketability and land, fulfilling careers. And this is such a small space that it's hard to, you can't Google, right? Who's willing to mentor me in this industry that hasn't started yet, that's right. So that's kind of a unique, value proposition to connect people who are passionate about the community building. So there's loads of opportunity. At the end of the day, I see my role as president as working with really any and every dedicated volunteer to find some kind of opportunity where they feel that their time is valued and that this is something that their contributions are meaningful. So it's very, very open door policy. And certainly any organizations out there that touch upon this space, we're always looking for sponsors and, collaboration opportunities. It's kind of a brave new world.
Awesome. Dan, my friend, thank you so much for being on the Omega podcast.
Thank you, Keenan.